purpose of this study is to help us get a grasp on what it looks like for a Christian to live faithfully in the new cultural situation we find ourselves in. You know, you've probably felt the changes happening all around you, the ground shifting beneath your feet. A few years ago, a sociologist named Aaron Renn made the observation that Christians had entered into a new era that he called the negative world. In the positive world, Christianity was considered a social asset, a necessary part of the underlying fabric of civilization, which Renn said existed in America up to 1994. In the neutral world, which he said spanned from 1994 to 2014, Christianity was considered one option among many. There was mostly a live and let live approach when it came to the secular establishment. But in 2014, with the Obergefell ruling by the Supreme Court, we entered into what he called the negative world. The negative world. And in the negative world, Christianity is considered a social ill, something toxic that is to blame for a lot of our problems. Renn's categories were a bit simplistic, and a lot has changed since Renn first named those categories in 2017, but they still provide a helpful framework for understanding some of the shifts that we know are happening. Now, we can lament these changes, but in many ways, they are our new reality. And that means we have to think carefully about how we engage our communities with the gospel during these coming days. The good news is that the Bible offers us all kinds of instructions for serving Jesus in that kind of environment, particularly through the books of Daniel in the Old Testament and 1 Peter in the New. They show us how to transcend the culture wars and actually transform the world. Maybe you felt like you've been swept up in a political culture war and you're just not sure what you're supposed to be doing. I mean, you really do want to be bold for Jesus, uncompromising, but you also want to live out the grace of Jesus as a blessing to your neighbors. Well, this study, with the book that goes along with it, Everyday Revolutionary, show you how you can do that. Let me be clear. We are not saying that Christians should avoid political discourse by any means. We're simply saying that we do that. We engage political discourse as ambassadors of Jesus Christ. That is, as those who recognize that their primary citizenship is in another kingdom, and as those who understand that their primary commission, their primary assignment, is to point others to the truth about this king. In this session, session 1, we're going to start with the book of Daniel. Now, Daniel, if you don't know, is a very unusual book in our Bibles. You see, it's one of the only books in the Old Testament that's not written in the Hebrew language. Hebrew, of course, being the language of Israel. Daniel is written in Aramaic, not Hebrew, because Aramaic is the language of Babylon, because Daniel wrote this book after he and his entire generation had been sent there to Babylon in exile. The introduction and the conclusion of Daniel are written in Hebrew, but the story parts, the narrative parts, are written in Aramaic, and the very structure of the book itself presents a question to Israel. The question's this: you Israelites know how to be faithful to God in Hebrew, but can you do it in Aramaic? I mean, is that even possible? Well, in the same way, many of us know what faithfulness to Jesus looks like in a church or in the boundaries of a society that share many of our basic values, but what does faithfulness look like in a secularized culture, in the negative world, where others do not share our values or sometimes are even hostile to them? Daniel shows us what faithfulness looks like in that kind of context. It's a very compelling story. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed Jerusalem, and he brought some of the best and the brightest in Israel into his palace to instruct them in the ways of Babylon, to give them what I like to call an MBA, a master's in the Babylonian arts. Daniel and his friends were selected to be in that very elite group, and they resolved that they were going to be faithful, above all things, faithful to God in Nebuchadnezzar's palace. So my question in this study is, how do we become like that in our society? Well, in this session, I want us to consider one major principle from Daniel's life that's going to set the stage for everything else. And that one principle is this: you can't make a difference unless you're different. And I want us to ask, how was Daniel different? And in what ways should Christians today expect to be most different in our societies? And what kind of reaction should we expect to get from our society when we live that way? You see, the lives of Christians are supposed to point to a different kingdom. But that doesn't mean we're supposed to be weird in a lot of the ways that people often think of Christians as weird. I grew up in a context where being a social misfit was considered a spiritual virtue. Our dress code was straight out of Little House on the Prairie. We kept our hair short. We didn't have beards because clearly that's what Jesus preferred. And our music style was a beautiful blend of the 16th and 17th centuries. I heard all kinds of sermons in those days on Isaiah's command to come out from among them and be ye separate. But is it clothing and hair length and music style that was supposed to most set the believer apart? Well, see, in Daniel, we see different things. Daniel chapter 1, verse 8 says it this way. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Their first test, these Hebrews' first test of faith came when they were commanded to eat the royal food and wine, because that included a number of things that God had specifically forbidden the Jewish people to eat. So Daniel asked that he and his friends be allowed to eat from a different menu, which honestly was probably an annoying request, because nobody in charge of feeding a group likes it when people ask for special menu items. But, verse 9, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, look, I'm afraid of Nebuchadnezzar, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to him, but just please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with whatever you see. So Daniel's supervisor agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. Now, watch this. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. Now, there's an irony at work here. Scripture says that honoring and glorifying God leads to human flourishing, and that happened for Daniel. But side by side with Daniel's flourishing came extreme opposition. And yet, Daniel and his friends aren't antagonistic toward the king, or they don't seem to subversively be working toward the overthrow of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. They genuinely seem to care about Nebuchadnezzar, and they want the prosperity of Babylon. Daniel and his friends were living out the command that God gave to the exiles through the prophet Jeremiah in his book, the book of Jeremiah, where Jeremiah says, to all the exiles whom I've sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, the Lord says, build houses and live in them. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare, you will find your welfare. So in other words, they didn't try to live in conclaves or as societal outsiders, and yet they were different, very different. Even though they'd taken Babylonian names and spoke fluent Aramaic, everybody knew that they didn't really belong there, in part because they refused to defile themselves with those things that God said were sinful. In chapter 3, we're going to see them refuse to bow down to idols the king commanded everybody else to bow down to. And in chapter 6, they're going to pray to the God of heaven, even when they're commanded not to. Now, we obviously are not under the same food restrictions as Daniel and his friends were, but there are two major ways that we can expect to be different in our day. Two ways in which we can expect for God to prosper us, even when we experience extreme and often costly opposition. Here's the first thing, though, the first way that we can expect to be different. Number one, our core claim is defiant. Nebuchadnezzar made a claim to absolute sovereignty, a claim Daniel and his friends did not and would not recognize. Interestingly, Daniel and his friends never get in trouble for their private religious beliefs. They get in trouble for refusing to recognize Nebuchadnezzar's authority in all things. You can see that in Daniel 3. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't throw them into the fiery furnace for worshiping God. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar himself had honored Israel's God in chapter 2. It was because they refused to also bow down to the idol that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Well, see, the same way Christians in Babylon, likely, we won't be punished for our private beliefs, but we will be pushed to keep those convictions private. We likely won't get in trouble, for example, for saying that Jesus is our Lord. It's when we say that he is Lord of all and we refuse to endorse viewpoints in opposition to his, that we will experience that kind of hostility. Christians in Peter's day faced a similar test. Scholars say that Rome had two basic religious rules for its entire empire. Religious rule number one, you can worship any God you want to worship. But religious rule number two, don't say your God is the only God or the supreme God, because then you'll think that you, as his people, should rule with him. You, they said to Roman citizens, you, whatever your religion is, you must acknowledge that Caesar is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Both Daniel and the early Christians refused to go along with those rules, the Babylonian rules or the Roman rules. They said, yes, we want to be submissive citizens. We want to work for the prosperity of our city. We want to be a blessing to Nebuchadnezzar, but there's only one who deserves our absolute allegiance. We recognize that not everybody shares our beliefs, and we can't force other people to believe anything. We know that, but we will not participate in anything God has called sinful, and we cannot endorse what God has condemned. Both Daniel and the early Christians were persecuted for maintaining that testimony, and we can expect to be too. But see, we can't ever back down from that one core claim, because it's the one claim God put us here to make. It is his purpose for having us in Babylon. Nor can we edit out whatever parts of his lordship our culture finds offensive at the moment. And realize that changes from culture to culture. You know that we're not the first culture in the world to be offended by Jesus, right? I served for a couple of years as a missionary to Muslims in Southeast Asia, and they really struggled with a certain part of Jesus' message that taught that you should forgive the adulterer, forgive the sinner. They were like, how can you forgive? That would unravel the entire fabric of society, right? They struggled with that part of Jesus' message, but they were fine with all the sexual morality teachings of Jesus. By contrast, the college students and the professors that I engage, they love Jesus' stuff on forgiveness, but they bristle at his teachings on the sanctity of life or marriage or gender. But whether I'm working with Muslims there in Southeast Asia or secularists on a university campus, I tell them that the core confession of our faith is that Jesus alone is sovereign. He's not a salad bar where we take the items we want and leave the rest, or a Build-A-Bear God that we assemble at a store from the God parts that you find appealing for your personal deity that makes you feel safe. Jesus, we say, is either Lord of all, or he's not Lord at all. As with Daniel, God promises to protect and to prosper his church as they make that confession. It doesn't mean that we won't suffer for it. We will, like Daniel did. But that confession that Jesus is Lord, that's the rock on which Jesus builds his church. Hear this, friend. Persecution will not kill the church. Compromise will. Had Daniel and his friends backed off of what God told them to do, I'm pretty sure we would have never heard their stories. Here's the second way that we can expect to be different. Our guiding values are upside down. We stand distinct from Babylon, not just because of what we believe, but also because of the values that we live by. Let me just talk in big strokes here about three primary differences between the Christian approach and the Babylonian approach to life. I borrow these three from a 5th century North African theologian named St. Augustine of Hippo. St. Augustine said that the lifestyles of Christians in Babylon will be most distinguishable from the lifestyles of the Babylonians in three primary ways. Way number one, he said, is money. Babylon approaches money from the standpoint of acquisition. Get all you can, keep all you can, and spend what you have on yourself. Maybe give away a little bit of it to show you're a good person or to gain some favor with the community, but money's primary purpose in Babylon is self-aggrandizement. Second way that will be different, Augustine said, is power. When it comes to power, Babylon sees power, like money, as something to be gathered, held onto, and then leveraged for self-benefit. Again, maybe you share a little bit of your power so that you get good marks for diversity and inclusion and philanthropy, but power is primarily the currency of self-promotion. Well, by contrast, Augustine said, for the Christian exile, power and money are resources given by God primarily for blessing the community, for lifting it up, and for promoting the kingdom. Believers understand that both money and power are stewardships from God, graciously given for our enjoyment, yes, but also for the glory of God and for the empowerment of others, especially those on the margins. Our bottom line is not ultimately profitability or self-promotion. Our bottom line is the blessing of our communities and the lifting up of others. Finally, Augustine highlighted the third big difference, he said, is sex. Babylon approaches sex from the standpoint of it's all about me. I write my own rules, and if it works for me, it can't be wrong. Well, by contrast, the Christian sees God as the author of life and sees something like sex as a gift from him to be used for his purposes, according to his designs. Tim Keller says, the early church was strikingly different from the culture around it in this way. The pagan society was stingy with its money and promiscuous with its body. A pagan gave nobody their money and practically gave everybody their body. The Christians came along and they gave practically nobody their body and they gave practically everybody their money. In other words, while Babylonians are promiscuous with their beds and guarded with their money, Christian exiles are promiscuous with their money and guarded with their beds. And so you see, when it comes to how we handle the big three, followers of Jesus, that's where they should expect to look different. And that's because we believe a completely different narrative about the world around us, and we shape our lives according to fundamentally different values. Christians in Babylon are indeed weird, but not because we have weird names or wear weird clothes or only listen to weird music. It's because we swear loyalty to a completely different king. Imagine, if you will, that you're watching a gigantic marching band through a set of binoculars, and you're noticing that everybody's in perfect sync. But as you stare through your binoculars, you see one guy in the middle of the field, in the middle of this marching band. He's just completely doing his own thing. When the band goes left, he goes right. When they duck, he jumps. When they stand still, he moves. You probably say, man, that guy is out of beat. But then you see that in his ears, he's got his noise-canceling AirPods, and you learn later that he's listening to some old school hit by Run DMC or Will Smith, DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, and he's listening to that tune that's being broadcast from a local radio station. Well, it turns out he is perfectly on beat. He's just tuned in to a different frequency than everybody else is. Well, see, that's what the Christian is supposed to be like in Babylon. We actually are perfectly on beat. We're just under the direction of a completely different conductor. God put us here, Christian. He put us here in the negative world to be signposts to the reality of a better and more powerful kingdom than Babylon. Daniel summarizes our assignment at the end of his book. He says, Daniel 12:3, those who turn many to righteousness will shine like the stars forever and ever. God put us here in Babylon to shine like stars from another universe, made all the more brilliant because of the inky darkness of the Babylonian sky that we shine in. To make a difference here, we have to be different, and we have to embrace that difference.